Jason was a chef running a small diner on the edge of town, struggling to make ends meet. Every day he noticed an elderly man sitting quietly on the curb outside, his tattered coat barely shielding him from the cold. The man's weathered face told a story of hardship, but he never asked for anything. On Thanksgiving evening, Jason saw the man again, huddled against the chill. Unable to ignore the sight, Jason approached him with a warm smile. "Sir, please, come inside and join me for dinner," he said. Jason led the man into his diner, seating him at a corner table with dignity and respect. As the elderly man enjoyed a steaming plate of turkey and sides, tears welled in his eyes. "It's been so long since someone treated me like a person," he whispered. But what he revealed after the meal would leave Jason speechless and change both their lives forever. Welcome to Graceful Storyteller, where every story brings hope and love. Jason watched the elderly man slowly savor the Thanksgiving meal he had prepared. The man's hands trembled as he gripped the fork, his weathered face softening with each bite. "Thank you," the man said quietly, glancing at Jason with eyes full of gratitude. "I can't remember the last time I had a meal like this." Jason sat down across from him, sensing the man's need for someone to listen. "What's your name, sir?" he asked gently. The man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "It's Edward," he finally said. "Edward Brooks." Jason recognized the name but couldn't quite place it. "Do you live nearby, Edward?" he asked. Edward shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Not anymore. My family. They pushed me out." The words hung heavy in the air. Jason leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Pushed you out? What happened?" Edward hesitated, his fingers brushing a thin gold chain around his neck. Hanging from it was a worn key. "I had everything once," he began. "A big house, a successful business, a family I thought loved me. But after my wife passed, my children, they saw me as a burden. They wanted the money, the house, everything I'd built. When I refused to sign it all away, his voice broke, and he paused to steady himself. They forced me out, locked the doors, changed the locks. That was 2 years ago." Jason felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over him. "I'm so sorry," he said. "No one deserves that, especially not from their own family." Edward nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "They took everything from me, but they couldn't take this." He held up the key. "This is the key to my old house. I keep it to remind myself of what was, and maybe, what could be again." As Edward finished his story, Jason felt an unshakable resolve to do more than just serve a meal. "Edward, you're welcome here anytime," Jason said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Edward smiled, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. "You've already done more for me than anyone else has in years." The diner was quiet as the meal ended. Edward thanked Jason once again before stepping out into the cold night, promising to return. Jason watched him disappear into the darkness, his heart heavy yet full of purpose. He couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were destined to cross again, and that Edward's story wasn't over yet. The next morning, Jason arrived at the diner, expecting to see Edward on the curb as usual. But the bench was empty, dusted with frost. Jason waited, glancing out the window between taking orders, but Edward never appeared. Concern gnawed at him. Maybe he's just somewhere warmer, Jason told himself, though he couldn't shake the unease. 3 days passed, and there was still no sign of Edward. Jason began asking around, speaking to people in the neighborhood. A street vendor shook his head. "Haven't seen him in days." "Hope he's all right," he said. Jason's heart sank. What if something happened to him, he thought. Then, on the 4th evening, just as Jason was closing up, the bell above the diner door jingled. A man in an expensive suit walked in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Jason froze mid-clean, startled by the stranger's presence. "We're closed," Jason said hesitantly, but the man smiled. "I'm not here for a meal," he said, extending a hand. "My name is Richard Kane. I'm a lawyer." Jason wiped his hands on his apron, unsure what to make of the situation. "A lawyer? What's this about?" he asked. Richard's smile faded. "It's about Edward Brooks." At the mention of Edward's name, Jason's pulse quickened. "Is he all right?" "I haven't seen him in days." Richard nodded, pulling out a sleek leather briefcase. "He's safe, don't worry. But he asked me to deliver something to you. May we sit? Jason nodded, gesturing to a booth. As they sat, Richard opened the briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. Before I hand this to you, there's something you should know. Jason leaned in, his heart pounding. Richard continued, Edward Brooks wasn't just a homeless man. He was once the CEO of a multi-million-dollar real estate company. The house he mentioned to you, his estate, is worth a fortune. But he gave it all up when his children betrayed him. After his wife passed, they pressured him to sign everything over to them. When he refused, they took drastic measures to strip him of everything. He's been living on the streets ever since. Jason was stunned. I knew he'd been through a lot, but I had no idea it was this bad. Richard slid the envelope across the table. Edward told me about you, how you treated him with respect when no one else would. He said your kindness gave him hope when he thought the world had forgotten him. He wanted you to have this. Jason opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten note from Edward, along with an old property deed. The note read, Jason, you reminded me of the goodness still left in people. This diner gave me warmth, but your kindness gave me strength. I want you to have this. It's the only thing I have left to give. Use it to keep spreading kindness, just as you did for me. Edward. Jason stared at the deed in disbelief. This is for the house, he asked. Richard nodded. Edward wanted you to have it. He said it's time for the house to bring people together, not divide them. Overwhelmed, Jason sat back, the weight of the gesture sinking in. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Richard smiled. There's more. Edward has also set aside a trust for you, enough to help you expand this diner and keep serving meals to those in need. Jason felt tears welling up. In one unexpected twist, his small act of kindness had created a ripple that was now changing his own life. The next morning, Jason stood in front of the diner, holding the deed in his hands. His mind raced with ideas. Edward's words echoed in his head. Use it to keep spreading kindness, Jason decided then, and there he wouldn't let Edward's generosity go to waste. Within weeks, Jason transformed his diner into a haven for the community. A new sign above the door read, Everyone's table, a place for all. With the trust Edward had left behind, Jason expanded the kitchen, hired additional staff, and launched a pay-it-forward program where customers could contribute to meals for those in need. But the surprises weren't over. One cold evening, as Jason served steaming bowls of soup to a table of homeless veterans, the diner door flew open. Two sharply dressed individuals stormed in, their expressions cold. We need to talk, one of them said. Her voice clipped. I'm Eleanor Brooks, Edward's daughter. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Eleanor and her brother, Thomas, sat across from him at a booth, their eyes narrowing. Our father gave you the deed to our family home, Eleanor said sharply. That house is our inheritance. We demand it back. Jason remained calm, though his heart pounded. Your father wanted the house to be used for good, he replied. He trusted me to honor his wishes. Thomas scoffed. He wasn't in his right mind. You took advantage of him. Jason's jaw tightened. I treated him with kindness when no one else would. If you cared so much about him, where were you when he needed you? Eleanor's face flushed, but before she could respond, a voice interrupted from the doorway. That's enough. Everyone turned to see Edward standing there, frail but resolute. He stepped inside, leaning on a cane. Dad, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Edward's gaze was firm. You lost the right to call me that when you abandoned me, he said, his tone steady. Jason showed me the compassion my own children couldn't. The house isn't yours, it's his now. Eleanor and Thomas sat in stunned silence as Edward continued. You two taught me a hard lesson about greed. Jason reminded me of the power of kindness. I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourselves further. Eleanor rose, her face pale. You'll regret this, she muttered before storming out. Thomas followed, slamming the door behind him. Edward turned to Jason, his expression softening. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Jason shook his head. You don't owe me an apology, Edward. I'm just glad you're here. Over the next few weeks, Jason and Edward worked together to repurpose the house. It became a shelter for families in need, complete with a kitchen for communal meals. The project brought the community together, with volunteers pouring in to help. One evening, as Jason locked up the diner, Edward joined him on the bench outside. "I never thought I'd feel at home again," Edward said, his voice filled with gratitude. Jason smiled. "You've given me more than I could ever repay. This is your home too." Months later, the diner was almost unrecognizable. The walls were adorned with thank you notes from people whose lives had been touched by Jason and Edward's kindness. A large mural near the entrance read, "Kindness given freely returns tenfold." The tables were always full, not just with paying customers, but with those who simply needed a meal and a warm place to belong. The house Edward had left behind became a sanctuary for the homeless. Families moved into its rooms, finding shelter and support. Every Sunday, Jason would cook a special dinner there, with Edward sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by laughter and hope. One evening, a local reporter visited the diner to interview Jason. "You've created something truly remarkable here," she said. "What inspired you to start this?" Jason smiled, his hand resting on the counter where he'd once served Edward his Thanksgiving meal. "It wasn't just me," he said. "Edward reminded me that even the smallest act of kindness can spark something bigger. This diner isn't just mine, it belongs to everyone." As the reporter left, Jason noticed a young boy standing hesitantly at the door. His clothes were worn and his face was smudged with dirt. Jason walked over and knelt down. "Are you hungry?" he asked gently. The boy nodded. Jason led him to a table and placed a warm meal in front of him. The boy's eyes lit up, and for a moment, Jason saw a reflection of Edward in his gaze. Later that night, as Jason and Edward sat on the bench outside the diner, Edward spoke softly. "You've done more than I ever imagined, Jason. This place, it's what I always hoped my family would be." Jason placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. "This is your legacy, Edward, and it's just the beginning." As the camera panned out, the lights of the diner glowed warmly in the night, a beacon of hope for the community. Jason's voice lingered in the air sometimes. It just takes one small act to change the world. And the best part, anyone can do it. Inspired by this story? Share your own act of kindness. Together we can create a world where no one is forgotten,